Now this is one of the best builds for the Mystic Spearhand in Dragon's Dogma 2. With this build you can easily destroy dragons or any other bosses while always staying invincible. Now the Mystic Spearhand is way overpowered compared to the other vocations, and I'll go over the best skill setup with this vocation. I'll also go over some alternate skills that you can use depending on your playstyle and the best place to upgrade your gear. So let's check this out. So first I'm going to show you destroying a dragon, and I got rid of the extra pawns to showcase this build. Now the reason the Mystic Spearhand is overpowered is because of one weapon skill, Mirror Shell. This skill will make you invincible for a certain amount of time, and you can spam this skill. Now I'm going to easily destroy this dragon because I do also have the best gear fully upgraded, and with this build I was able to easily farm dragons during my first playthrough in the end game. But I'll go over everything in more details in their dedicated sections. So checking out the weapon skills. Now the Mystic Spearhand has some good weapon skills, but you can change some skills around depending on your playstyle. And I'll share some alternate skills that you can use, but I'll explain why I'm personally not using these skills. So now the best weapon skill for the Mystic Spearhand is Mirror Shell. This skill will cast a barrier on you and your party, which will make you invincible. The barrier will last around 10 seconds long if you upgraded it, and you can spam this skill if you have enough stamina. But this skill doesn't use a lot of stamina, so you can practically spam it throughout whole fights. So what I do to basically have this barrier up all the time is you can either do 3 magic cuts, then Mirror Shell and repeat, or you can use 8 twin cuts and then cast Mirror Shell and repeat. And by doing this, you will have the Mirror Shell active all the time. Another thing is that with this skill, you can't get staggered when it's active. So if one of your pawns go down, you can easily revive them. This is probably one of the best and most overpowered skill in the game. The next weapon skill I'm using is Dragoon's Foin. This skill will launch you to an enemy that you are facing, so it is really good to close the distance. Now if there are no enemies around, it'll just launch you in a straight line, and this is useful to reach some places that are difficult to get to. And you can use this skill on the ground or in mid-air. I typically use this skill to get to flying enemies to knock them down to the ground and to reach difficult places. Now the next 2 weapon skills you can switch around depending on your playstyle, because I only use these skills in certain situations. So the next weapon skill I'm using is Sky Dragoon's Fest, and this skill will make you blink on top of an enemy and do a dive attack to them. And this skill is good if you're stuck or surrounded, because it can blink you out of a difficult situation. This skill is also good for just dodging enemies' attacks because you will blink out of the way. And the last weapon skill I'm using is Magic Spear Gun, and this is a range skill that you can charge up for more damage. Now when this skill is charged up, it does huge amounts of damage, so you can melt bosses with this skill. This skill also does AoE damage, so you can clear groups of enemies. Now I typically only use this skill if I can't reach the enemies and on bosses that have vital points, because it does drain a lot of stamina. Okay, so the first alternate weapon skill you can use in the early to mid game is Ravenor's Haunt, and this skill will drain stamina from an enemy. This skill is good because you're not going to have a lot of stamina in the early levels, and it's very easy to run out of stamina, and you will unlock this skill very early. Now by the time you reach endgame, you should know how to play and manage your stamina better, so you're not going to use this skill as much. And there are a lot of items that can recover your stamina that you can easily farm or just buy from the vendor once you're at endgame. And the next alternate weapon skill you can use is the Meister skill, Wild Fury. This skill will launch you to an enemy and release a flurry of slashes and magical attacks, and you can keep using this skill to extend the skill. Now this skill is good for clearing trash mobs, but your other skills and basic attacks can easily also clear trash mobs, so it's not really needed. This skill does also use a ton of stamina, especially if you extend it, so personally I don't use this skill. But if you want a flashy and cool looking move, then definitely pick up this skill. Next for the core skills. Now the core skills for the Mystic Spearhand isn't as useful compared to the other vocations. The one core skill that could be used is Winding Cut, and this core skill will basically make you constantly attack with no downtime. Now ideally I only use this core skill when bosses are staggered and their vital points are in range, but other than that I typically don't use any of the Mystic Spearhand's core skills. Okay, so next for the augments. Now the augments are not required for the Mystic Spearhand to be overpowered, but it will make the game easier by boosting your stats or recovery. So the first augment I'm using is from the fighter, and it's Diligence. And this augment is useful because it will hasten your recovery time when you're crawling. So if you get staggered, this will help you recover faster. The next augment I'm using is Lethality from the archer, and this skill will increase your damage when striking a target's vital. So this skill is really good for destroying bosses. Now the next augment I'm using is Avidity from the archer, and this will allow you to climb and move faster when you're scaling an enemy. This skill is useful because once you reach endgame, you'll need to start climbing bosses more often to hit their vital spots. The next augment I'm using is stability from the thief, and this augment will decrease the likelihood of being targeted by enemies. This augment is useful because if the enemies are not attacking you, you won't get staggered, and getting staggered is very annoying because if you get staggered, it will interrupt your attacks and skills. And the next augment I'm using is exaltation from the mage, and this augment will increase your stamina recovery, which is really useful. And the last augment I'm using is verb from the thief, and this will increase your strength, and of course more strength is more damage. Okay, so next for the equipment. Now, most of the equipment I'm using is from the Dragon Forge, exchanged for worm life crystals. And these crystals are farmable by killing dragons. The only equipment I'm not using from the Dragon Forge is the cloak and the rings, but everything else is from the Dragon Forge. Now, just be aware that you don't need the best equipment to farm dragons and destroy bosses. You can use the equipment you buy at the vendor. It will just take longer to kill the bosses, but time is not an issue with this build because you can always just stay invincible. So the weapon I'm using is the Lindworm Fang. The helmet I'm using is the Dragon Knight's helmet. The body armor I'm using is the Varshara scale skin, and the leg armor I'm using is the Strider's greaves. Now the cloak is not really needed, but I'm just using it for style. But I'm using the Champion's mantle. Next for the rings, the first ring I'm using is the Ring of Quickening, and this ring will boost your stamina recovery. And the second ring I'm using is the Ring of Brawn, and this ring will increase your strength depending on how much weight you're carrying. Okay, so that's pretty much the equipment I'm using for this build, and here are my stats. And if you don't have this equipment, then you can just use the equipment from the vendors, because you don't need the best equipment to farm dragons with this build, because you can technically be invincible for the whole fight with the weapon skill Mirror Shelled. Okay, so next for upgrading your equipment. Now I did upgrade all my equipment in Vern. The reason why is that Vern upgrades will increase all your stats and reduce your weight. So since the Mystic Spearhand uses both physical and magical attacks, upgrading the weapon from Vern is the best option. And for the armor, upgrading from Vern will decrease the weight of the armor, allowing you to run faster. Okay, so now really quickly, if you want to check out my stats, I'm level 54. Now I did beat my first playthrough when I was level 44. So being level 54, I'm way over leveled and the game is now really easy. Now when I was in the lower levels, it used to take like 15 to 20 minutes to kill a dragon. But now since I'm level 54 and have really good gear, it only takes like 3 to 5 minutes to kill a dragon, depending on what type of dragon I'm fighting. And because of the weapon skill, Mirror Shelled, fighting dragons or any bosses was no challenge, especially when you know the timings and when to barrier up. Now if you want some challenge in your playthrough, I recommend to use a different vocation, because the Mystic Spearhand and the one weapon skill Mirror Shelled is way too overpowered. And I'm quickly going to show you destroying this dragon. Okay, so thanks for checking out one of the best builds for the Mystic Spearhand in Dragon's Dogma 2. Now with this build, you should be invincible in all fights and can easily take down any bosses. This is the vocation I used to easily clear my first playthrough, and this vocation is basically the most overpowered vocation in the game. Hope this helps in more videos to come, so stay tuned. And definitely give your pawns a high five.